Hello, 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 hello. Hello and welcome to the Child Psych Podcast. I'm Tanya Johnson, registered psychologist, registered play therapist, co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology, and probably most importantly, a mum. So excited to have Professor Michael Pleuss here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, excited. You're tuning in with us from the other side of the world. It's great.
Yeah.
Where are you exactly in the UK?
So I'm at the University of Surrey in Guildford, which
Okay.
is about a 30-minute train ride from London. I do live in London, but yeah, the university is outside of London.
Got it. Got it. That helps. I've been to London, so I can sort of place it a little bit.
Yeah.
Before we jump right in, I'd like to just do a quick introduction. Professor Michael Pleuss is an expert on how experiences shape the course of psychological development across life. He is a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Surrey. Much of Professor Pleuss's research focuses on individual differences in the capacity for environmental sensitivity. The notion that some people are more affected than other people by negative as well as positive experiences. In addition, he is specifically interested in positive aspects of development, including the design and empirical evaluation of intervention programs for mental health and well-being. Fascinating. I have so many questions about this. I feel like here in North America, we're based in Alberta, in Canada.
Oh.
More and more people are becoming interested in the topic of sensitivity. I'm not sure if you're seeing the same thing there. But I'm wondering for you on your own journey, what led you to do so much discovery around sensitivity?
Yeah, so it's a topic that used to be fairly niche and it's becoming more and more popular. And there's also a lot more research that is being done on the area. It's quite for me, it was quite a challenge to some of the things I've been taught in psychology as doing my undergraduate and master studies in psychology. I've learned a lot about the vulnerability stress interplay, in the sense of that some children are more likely to develop problems when they face challenges because they sort of carry an inherent vulnerability with them. It could be genetic, could be a temperament trait that makes them more vulnerable to develop problems. If they don't have that vulnerability, then they basically are resilient when faced with an adverse situation. So that was basically the leading framework on sort of person environment interplay in the development of mental health. And I always found it a bit strange that, why do some people exist that are at particular risk to develop problems? Um, and then when I was speaking to Jay Belsky, under whom I did my PhD, and I had a visit with him in London. I'm originally from Switzerland, so I was traveling to London to meet with him to discuss my PhD plans. And he introduced me to the idea of differential susceptibility, which is a very complicated word for what I refer now to as sensitivity. And according to his ideas, he suggested that some people have a generally higher degree of susceptibility or sensitivity. That means, yes, they're more negatively impacted by negative experiences, but because they have a general level of heightened susceptibility, they also benefit more from positive experiences. And that explains why we do have a population with more and less sensitive individuals, because both come with pros and cons. So it's not just that some children or individuals have generally a higher risk to develop problems when they face challenging situations. No, these people do particularly well in supportive contexts. So that was a total paradigm shift for quite a few areas, actually, of developmental psychology, where we considered certain temperament traits in children as risk factors for the development of problems, we suddenly thought, oh, okay, difficult temperament or high reactive temperament, often considered a precursor of the development of behavioral problems, that actually seemed to be associated with sensitivity. That means children with that kind of temperament, yes, they develop more problems if they're, if they're growing up in an environment that's not very supportive, but they do especially well when they grow up in a caring and supportive environment. They actually do better than children without that temperament trait. So that was sort of blowing my mind back then. I thought,
Incredible.
oh, this makes so much more sense. But
Really
that
does.
was a new idea in
Yeah.
psychology. And so I got involved. I decided to do my PhD on that topic and started with differential susceptibility, looking at early child temperaments and some genetics as well. And then over the years, I started moving more towards measuring sensitivity with questionnaires in many different other ways.
Mm,
So
mm,
that's my
yeah.
entry into the field. And as I think as part of that, I realized I think I will have been a highly sensitive child.
Uh-huh,
Um,
uh-huh.
that
It's
was
amazing.
fortunate growing up in a very caring environment.
Yeah, as I've learned more and more about the topic, I definitely fall into the highly sensitive category too. But Michael, as you're talking, it just makes so much sense to me. Is if we're sensitive to stress, we're also sensitive to really positive, nurturing environments. Which
Mm.
before all of this research, I would have been like, no, they're just more stressed out kids. But as you say that today, I'm like, that just makes so much sense.
Yeah, I mean it's important to acknowledge that there will be some that are particularly sensitive to stress, and you can be affected by stress for different reasons. But there is a subgroup of people that are more responsive to stress because they're generally more responsive. So not all of the stress responses are a result of heightened
Mm,
sensitivity, but some of it could be explained by that common trait of sensitivity.
absolutely. So I know that we have a whole lot of parents listening in right now wondering if their child is highly sensitive. Some of the things that I've just heard you say is there's a higher likelihood that your child is more sensitive if they respond really well to positive environments, but they also are more likely to be activated by stressful environments. Those are two huge characteristics.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So sensitive children usually have specific characteristics. It's a continuum of sensitivity that's important to mention. So everyone is sensitive to some degree, but some children are just a lot more sensitive. That means they're characterized by a higher sensory sensitivity. So they pick up on more subtleties in their environment. They might perceive more um, details in their environment. They will perceive more of what's going on socially. They're more affected by the brightness of the lights or if it's loud where they are. So they perceive more in their senses, but then at the same time, they also process those experiences more deeply than maybe other children. So when they experience maybe a conflict at school, even if it didn't involve them directly, but they observed it, they might, these are the children that keep thinking about it and wondering why was that, and they might get really upset about unfair treatment, even if it involves other people rather than themselves. So sensitive children sort of, they perceive more about what's going on around them, but then they process that also more deeply.
Makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. So when we think about these children who perceive and process just on this beautiful depth, what happens with our parenting style with that?
I think there's a lot of research has been done on parenting, and there's many different ways in how we can measure parenting. And basically, what we do find is that the parenting style that is generally associated with more positive development in children is the one that is particularly important for sensitive children. Basically, sensitive children respond to, generally caring support, but also they need boundaries, or they need clear structure. So there's different parenting styles, and the most positive of the four common personality traits is um, authoritative parenting, which is a combination of providing structure, being quite consistent, having clear rules in place, but also being emotionally available and caring and supportive. So that combination seems to be generally good for children, but particularly for highly sensitive children. They benefit from an environment that is caring, but also that helps them with the regulation, the behavioral regulation, emotional regulation, which is provided through sort of the, having rules in place and a routine.
Beautiful. And those big feelings that I think are often associated with our highly sensitive children,
Hmm.
any thoughts on how to kind of work with those big feelings?
I think for parents, it will be very important to firstly understand and accept that their child might be, a highly sensitive child, and often one of the parents will be highly sensitive as well. So yes, it's correct what you say. Highly sensitive children will have stronger emotions. They will have stronger emotional reactions to negative experiences, but also to positive ones, which I think is important to always be aware of, because it's easy to be aware of the negative emotions because they're more work. But the positive emotions are there as well. And so basically, the way to navigate that is to be aware that my child is more sensitive, therefore will have stronger emotional reactions, and that child needs my help in regulating those emotions and may need my help in talking through those emotions. So the way to manage that is to firstly understand the child is responding more strongly emotionally because they have stronger emotions maybe than other children do. So the challenge for them will be to manage and regulate those emotions, and that's where they need help. Each child needs help. The way that emotion regulation works is that we internalize it based on the parenting that we receive, right? We all internalized the self-regulation that has been, that we observed in our parents, or that we learned directly from them and from others as well. So highly sensitive children really benefit from us helping them with their emotion regulation. That includes being aware of the environments that we expose the child to, and to sort of be able to predict, is that environment going to be overwhelming for my child? That doesn't mean we should avoid it, but maybe we want to keep an eye on how long they remain in that environment, right? So that they don't end up being completely overwhelmed and emotionally drained, but also to just to give them room for their emotions,
Mm-hmm.
and to talk with them about their emotions and to validate their emotions, but also helping them to understand under what conditions that emotion or that expression of emotions is not acceptable, is not helpful.
I love that. So there's lots of validation within a structure, within limits. So this is what these feelings are. It's okay for you to have those feelings, but there are ways that we need to express those feelings in a way that keeps it kind of respectful for everybody in the environment.
Yeah, and I think even in adult people, where adults that have strong emotions don't necessarily understand sometimes their emotions. So this is where it's really important to talk with the child about their emotions,
Mhm.
so that the child is having develops a good understanding of their emotions and why they might have experienced those emotions. That's fine to have those emotions, nothing wrong with that, but to learn how to now navigate those strong emotions.
That's really the key, isn't it? The how to, which I think many, like you said, many adults are still trying to figure that part out too.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, it's the I think it's in developmental psychology. I think it's a really interesting picture of how, as a child, a young baby has no regulation or very limited regulation capacity. The baby is regulated by the parent, right? The baby cries, and then the parent does whatever they, you know or finding out what they need to do to stop the crying, by feeding the baby or by holding it. What they're doing is they're regulating the emotional state of that baby. And as the child becomes older, those regulations continue, but they become a bit more sophisticated. But over time, the child will internalize those strategies and they will be able to regulate themselves. So that's, I think, a really important part of parenting, is that we help the child to regulate. And a highly sensitive child will have a little bit more to regulate. So they might need a bit more support, but also they will react more strongly to certain experiences. So they can get overwhelmed in an environment, even in a positive environment where they play with their friends. If they played with their friends for a few hours, they might just be overwhelmed and drained by that and might need some downtime.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's really, I'm hearing co-regulation needs to happen before self-regulation with all of our kids, but probably especially with our highly sensitive kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael, you'd mentioned earlier that if the child is highly sensitive, there's a high likelihood that there's a parent in the house who is highly sensitive. What is the genetic link there? Are these really
So there
high?
is a significant genetic contribution to sensitivity. We've conducted a twin study comparing identical twins with fraternal twins. And this is a classic approach to estimate the heritability, the genetic contribution to differences that we can observe between people. And we found that about 50% of the differences in sensitivity between people can be explained by heritability or by genetic factors. And this is fairly comparable to other common traits, personality traits, temperament, and so forth, that about half of the variance, so half, 50% of the differences that we see between people can be explained by genetic factors. So it is influenced by genetic factors, but it's also influenced by environmental factors to about the same degree. That's what we found in our study. And the participants in our study were about 17 years old when they completed the sensitivity questionnaire. So it was based on their self-reported sensitivity that we were able to look at the heritability.
It's fascinating. And when we look kind of anatomy-wise, are we literally just seeing more sensitive nervous systems? Is that what we're seeing inside our highly sensitive children?
So that hasn't, I'm not aware of research that looked at that. So the idea, the theory behind it is that highly sensitive children have a more sensitive central nervous system. And I'm not aware of any studies that looked at the brain in children. Well, I've been involved in one study where we did that, but it wasn't in relation to sensitivity. It was a study on sensitivity, but without having a measure of sensitivity. So basically, we were looking at whether certain brain areas, the size, the structure of the brain area, would make children more or less sensitive to the quality of their environment. And we did find that children that have a larger amygdala, which is a small part of the brain involved in emotion processing, we did find that those children benefit more from a more, basically from a higher quality environment. So we have some ideas of specific brain areas that might be associated with sensitivity. There are several studies that have been conducted looking at the brain in adults that found that certain brain areas are a bit more activated in sensitive individuals compared to less sensitive individuals. But the really interesting findings that has been published recently is that the brains of highly sensitive people seem to be more connected. So the different brain areas seem to be more connected.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. So would you consider sensitivity a neurodiversity?
That's a big discussion at the moment.
Like, that's
I
another
think
podcast, Tanya.
it is. I think the difficulty is that the term neurodiversity is being used quite differently by different people. In a way, where do you draw the line? Some people draw the line with autism and ADHD. So these are conditions that have very well-defined criteria, where you meet them or you don't meet them. But sensitivity is not a diagnosis. It's a common trait. So everyone is sensitive, but some people are much more sensitive than others. So generally, I would say if we would say sensitivity is neurodiversity, then we sort of end up in a space where everyone's neurodiverse, which is probably true that all of our brains are slightly different, right?
Mhm.
So, but that's probably not the idea of the term of neurodiversity. Um, I personally think because it's a common trait and we don't really have evidence that the brains of highly sensitive individuals are fundamentally different. I probably would not necessarily use that term, but I can imagine that when we look at the higher end of sensitivity, like extreme cases, then maybe at that level it might be helpful.
Mhm.
It's probably mostly helpful in cases where people really experience it as a challenge,
Mhm.
um, to understand maybe their level of sensitivity as a neurodiversity. Um, but
That was
at the most fundamental level, I would say it's just a basic human trait.
Mhm.
And people differ in that trait, just as some people are more introverted, others are more extroverted. That's as well a basic human trait. I don't think we would necessarily consider, people that are extremely extroverted as neurodiverse.
Mhm.
Um,
That
but
makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah. So when we look and we go, this isn't diagnosable, it's not a disorder. When we are kind of in that topic of mental health for our kids, are children who are highly sensitive more susceptible to mental health issues?
we do find that. Yeah, we do find that highly sensitive people, children and adolescents and adults, they seem to experience more mental health symptoms as well. And even when we use measures that don't contain sort of questions that overlap with mental health questionnaires, we do find that higher sensitivity is associated with a higher risk for mental health problems. And I think that's a really important thing to know. Um, the reasons for that, I think, have to do with the fundamental characteristics of sensitivity. That if you perceive more in your environment and you process that more deeply, then obviously it depends on what you're processing. And if you experience loss, if you experience trauma, and you process that and you perceive that much stronger than other we would, then it makes sense that maybe these children are more likely to develop problems. But so this is an area where we have to do more research. But I would think that in the case of highly sensitive individuals, the mental health is often a function of maybe experiences that they had that were quite difficult and challenging.
Mhm.
But yeah, sensitive children and sensitive adults seem to be at more risk to develop mental health. They seem to be more likely to engage in behaviors that are not good for their mental health, such as rumination. So there's
Mhm.
one paper that we published a few years ago, and actually that's quite interesting because we measured sensitivity, um, not by self-report, but by behavior observation. So the children were 3 years at a time where we filmed them in standardized situations. So they entered a room with new toys or objects that were unfamiliar to them. And we measured in how they approached those things, those toys and situations, and we rated them on their sensitivity based on that. And we also had information on the parenting of the parents, and we found that parents that are more permissive, in a sense they provide less structure and let the child just do whatever they want to do, those children, um, the highly sensitive children that experience that kind of parenting, they are more likely to engage in ruminative behaviors.
Mm.
And then that is associated with higher depression symptoms.
Mm.
So that could be one potential pathways, that highly sensitive children are particularly good at thinking repeatedly about the same thing, and they're particularly good at imagining things. So that is shown in higher creativity, but also they're really good at imagining how things could go wrong in the past. So that's why it's not necessarily surprising that we do see associations between sensitivity and anxiety disorders. But importantly, not every child that is highly sensitive develops mental health problems. I think it's really the combination of being highly sensitive and then experiencing maybe a challenging environment growing up, or sort of a traumatic experience or traumatic loss. We actually, in one of the studies that we've conducted, we looked at development over several decades. And instead of measuring sensitivity with a questionnaire, we used a genetic measure of sensitivity. And we found that children that had a higher genetic sensitivity, but grew up in a high quality environment, they were actually more resilient in adulthood than other children.
Wow.
And my interpretation of those findings is that highly sensitive children, if growing up in a not ideal environment, might be more likely to be more susceptible to stress and mental health. But if they grow up in a very supportive environment, they are able to acquire the coping strategies that they need to deal with challenges later on. So even though genetically or physiologically or psychologically, they are maybe less resilient, they can acquire the resilience in an environment that is helpful. We actually also found in a school-based interventions that was for 12 and 13-year-old girls in London, we found that the highly sensitive children, the highly sensitive girls, were the only ones benefiting from the intervention. Their depression symptoms actually decreased over time and remained low, which again, and that's something that we found in other studies as well. The highly sensitive children, they seem to internalize their experiences more. So that means even when they experience therapy or a school-based intervention, and that one was based on sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, they internalize those strategies and they seem to really benefit from that. And we even found that with genetic sensitivity in adults regarding a relationship intervention, that those people genetically more sensitive, they benefited more from the intervention longer term.
I think that that's so hopeful for so many parents to go, yes, they may be more sensitive to the challenging aspects of life, but when in a supportive environment, they flourish.
Yes, they highly sensitive children might be at a higher risk to develop mental health problems. It doesn't mean they necessarily develop mental health problems, but they are at higher risk. But also, they seem to be more responsive to psychotherapy. They seem to be more responsive to support. So we have found that with a school-based resilience intervention, we have found that with school-based anti-bullying interventions, the sensitive children benefit most from those interventions. So even though they might be more at risk to develop mental health problems because of their sensitivity also helps them to really benefit from psychological therapy.
It's amazing. Interventions wise, I've heard you mention resiliency programs, CBT, and then just kind of more like school-wide strategy programs like anti-bullying. Are those the ones that kind of come up in the research right now in terms of a good fit with our highly sensitive children?
Those are the ones that have been investigated. It's a relatively new field, so there's a lot more that needs to be done. There is quite a bit that work that is focused on parenting, different parenting styles, sort of comparing more, harsh parenting or negative parenting with more supportive parenting, but also parenting interventions. And all of those studies show that the highly sensitive children are much more impacted by the parenting that they receive than other children. So the low sensitive children, basically, for them, it almost doesn't seem to matter what kind of parenting that they receive. It doesn't seem to have a big impact on them. So that's, again, sort of, yes, maybe a highly sensitive child could be a bit more of a challenge for parents, but at the same time, what you invest into a highly sensitive child is going to probably make a big difference in that child, a bigger difference than it would in another child. So we've seen in our studies that more sensitive children that experienced caring environments, they did really outperform other children, even academically. They seem to really be able to, to extract the support from their environment and benefit from that. Whereas a low sensitive child might be generally more resilient, maybe less likely to develop the same kind of mental health problems a highly sensitive child might do, but at the same time, they don't really benefit from the positive experiences as other children do.
Beautiful. Michael, any final words for everybody listening in today that you'd like to leave them with on sensitivity and our children?
Yeah, so we have a website called sensitivityresearch.com where we have online questionnaires or online tests where people can test themselves, the children can test themselves. So it's absolutely free. It's based on our research. These are the questionnaires that we use for our research. So that's also where we have more information on sensitivity. So I recommend that. So that's sensitivityresearch.com. I think one thing to consider, we've spoken a lot about highly sensitive children, but adults also differ in their sensitivity, and parents can be also highly sensitive. So that means, that's a related topic, but maybe a different blog. But yeah, as parents, we need to manage our sensitivity as well in relation to our children, and understand, in what way does it affect us. It can be quite overwhelming, especially with younger children. The constantly having to think about that, and processing, and the constant information you get from the child. So it can be overwhelming, and a lot of highly sensitive parents do feel quite overwhelmed in the beginning. And sometimes it might just help for the parents to know, I am feeling overwhelmed because I'm a highly sensitive mother, or I'm a highly sensitive father. So just to take that into account as well, because we do know it has a genetic component. It's likely that if there is a highly sensitive child, that the parents are highly sensitive as well, or at least one of them, and that means that comes with challenges for them as well. But highly sensitive parents can be fantastic parents because they're really great at reading their child. They're really great at having a sense of what would be good for the child, or what is a problem for the child. And so it's a fantastic thing for parenting, but also highly sensitive parents can easily be overwhelmed by the chaos that parenthood brings with it.
Absolutely. Such important words. I know for me, I reach a threshold and then I need some space and some alone time and some quiet where I can find it. And then I can come back into the situation. I've got two little ones. But I think it's exactly what you're saying, that awareness, and then what are my coping strategies, not just what are my child's coping strategies.
And that is very similar to children. So I know of my brother's a primary school teacher, and he told me of that one child that seemed to be perfectly well in school, but the parents told him that when that child comes back from school, he needs about 2 hours to just rest because he's so tired, he's so exhausted by the school. But my brother didn't have any sense of that, and I think the reason is because highly sensitive children may mask their sensitivity in school because they want to get along with everyone else. So they might play more wildly than they would like to, or longer than they would like to, or they play in a certain way that they probably, wouldn't necessarily do so. So when they come home, they might just be exhausted. And just as a highly sensitive parent needs time to rest, and often that time is just giving yourself time to process something, or to being overwhelmed by lots of sensory input, to just have a bit of time when you don't have that sensory overload. So the same thing that apply to us as adults would apply to the child as well, that they sometimes just need a bit of time to themselves, and that as a parent we need to manage that. And if we know my child would really enjoy that party, but they will be exhausted afterwards because they're sensitive, so they might still go to the party, but I might manage how long will they be there and take them out of it before they before they fall apart.
Yeah. Michael, such empowering information, I think, for parents out there. I think when we can go, this is what I'm dealing with, and there are amazing things that I can do for my child, I think it just shifts how parents feel altogether. So your work is just so incredibly important.
Thank you. I'm glad to help. And I think, highly sensitive children are amazing. And yeah, they might be at times a bit more challenging because they respond more to their context, but they have huge potential and they have higher levels of empathy. They are really good at understanding other people. So they have great potential and are wonderful children. So if someone has a highly sensitive child and they're worried about that, they should just, also celebrate the positive aspect of having a highly sensitive child.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michael.